If you know anything about the Hollywood sign in LA, or even if you've seen Ryan Murphy's Hollywood, which came out on Netflix in 2020, you probably know a little bit about the story of Peg Entwistle, the actress who jumped off the Hollywoodland sign to her death in 1932. In the show Hollywood, an up and coming screenwriter tries to write a movie about the story of Peg and her tragic demise. In the end, the story ends up being changed, her name changed from Peg to Meg, and the ending made more optimistic. This led me to want to think about the real woman that was behind the story. Today we'll discuss a little history of the sign itself, then we'll talk about who Peg was and her tragic ending. Let's start with the sign itself. The original Hollywood sign was built in 1923 and read Hollywoodland as an advertisement for a newly developing area. Harry Chandler, the Los Angeles Times editor at the time, paid $21,000 for the sign to be built and lit up to promote a housing development in which he had invested. The sign would light up in 3 sections: Holly, Wood, Land, and then the whole thing at once, Hollywoodland, on a rotating basis. Imagine living close to that sign with it flashing all day and all night. Yikes. The original sign was supposed to only stand for about a year and a half while the housing development was completed. However, it was never taken down and just stayed up. With no one maintaining the sign, it fell into disrepair during the Depression, and the H even mysteriously fell over altogether in the 1940s. More on that later. In 1949, the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce took over the sign and its maintenance. When doing this, they dropped the land part. I guess the extra 4 letters costs more money to maintain, and they refurbished the Hollywood part, and that's the part you see today. The sign at the time, and pretty much still today, stands for a symbol of the hopes and the dreams that Hollywood represents. As we'll discuss, unfortunately for Peg, her Hollywood dreams were never realized, and the sign was instead a nightmare. Who was Peg? Millicent Lillian Entwistle, nicknamed Peg, was born February 5th, 1908, in Port Talbot, Wales, to Emily and Robert Symes Entwistle. From there, some of her early details get a bit murky. Robert was an actor, and it's unclear what happened to her mother. Some reports say that she died when Peg was a very young girl, but there's other evidence that her parents were just divorced and the mother left the family. Peg's father's will, which was dated December 15th, 1922, when Peg would have been about 14 years old, read, quote, Millicent Lillian Entwistle is the daughter of my first wife, whom I divorced, and the custody of my said daughter was awarded to me. I do not desire my said daughter to be at any time in the custody or control of her said mother, end quote. There's also conflicting reports on when she came to America. Some reports say that Peg came to the U.S. on the SS Philadelphia in 1916 and emigrated to New York City with her father. However, documents from the Entwistle family show that Peg and her father were in Ohio and New York in 1913, and her father is listed as being in the cast of several plays in 1913. Nonetheless, she ends up in America. Sadly, in 1922, her father Robert was the victim of a hit-and-run motorist. I have to specify motorist because horse and buggies were still being used in New York City at that time. Peg, now about 14, along with her 2 younger half-brothers, were sent to live with their uncle. A few years later, in 1925, through the use of family connections, Peg went to Boston to study at the Henry Jewett's Repertory and was one of the Henry Jewett players. One of her early credited roles was in Hamlet starring Ethel Barrymore, where she was tasked to carry the king's train and to bring in the poison cup. Over time, she started getting larger parts, and later in 1925, she played the role of Hedwig in the play The Wild Duck. Betty Davis, in the audience one night at about 17, saw Peg's performance and told her mother, I want to be exactly like Peg Entwistle. Throughout her life, Betty Davis would say that Peg was one of the inspirations for her to become an actress. Peg was starting to get noticed, and in 1926, she was recruited to the prestigious New York Theater Guild. Her first credited on-Broadway performance was in The Man from Toronto, and she would continue in several other plays for the Guild through 1932. She would get married to actor Robert Keith in 1927, but later divorced a few years later in 1929. Peg claimed that he forgot to tell her that he had been married before and had a 6-year-old son. Yeah, that's quite the omission. Robert was a man known in theater circles for his debts, arrests, and abusive behavior. Entwistle soon realized that the New York theater world was shutting her out due to their perceptions about her husband. She decided to get away from that sinking ship to both save her life and career. Especially considering it was the 1920s, good for her. While on tour with the Theater Guild in LA, she was in a play called The Mad Hope starring Billy Burke, who would later go on to play Glinda the Good Witch in The Wizard of Oz a few years later. The play caught the eye of David O. Selznick, who would then later go to produce Gone with the Wind a few years later, who instructed director George Cukor to contact Peg. RKO Studios was considering her for the role in their up-and-coming picture, A Bill of Divorcement. In her excitement, Peg told anyone that would listen, friends, family, and the cast and crew of her play. This did not go over well at all with the play's producer and the theater community in general. Leaving a play early, and especially leaving due to the lure of Hollywood, was more than a bit frowned upon. Peg didn't get the role in Bill of Divorcement, and it ended up being the screen debut for another up-and-coming actress from the theater, Katharine Hepburn. Katharine's story ends up being pretty much the exact opposite of Peg's. Instead of landing A Bill of Divorcement, prior to her play closing, Peg was offered a small supporting role by RKO Studios in 13 Women, starring Myrna Loy and Irene Dunne. She wasn't given a contract with RKO, but thought it was still best to take that chance and leave her play for the shot at Hollywood stardom. This would end up being Peg's first and last appearance on the big screen. Before its premiere, 14 minutes of the movie ended up being cut, mostly of Peg's scenes. All that was left of her performance was 15 seconds. The movie premiered October 14th, 1932, a month after her death. Although it had some critical success, it was not a commercial one. The reasons for her scenes being cut were probably due more to the fact that she was playing a lesbian, and the Hays Code censors had started to take a hold of Hollywood. Therefore, the cuts were most likely not about the actual acting. But she was still devastated and didn't get the contract with RKO that she had so hoped for. She had pinned all of her hopes on RKO working out, and she could not easily go back to Broadway since she had effectively burned that bridge by leaving her play early. Is this disappointment what led to her demise? It's hard to say exactly why she did it. An easy explanation would be that she was not offered a contract at RKO, but there's probably more to it than that. According to Peg's uncle, she was depressed and, quote, suffering intense mental anguish, end quote. Peg was known to be impulsive and moody, and at the time of her suicide, she had recently learned of her ex-husband's remarriage. Not only was he remarried, but it was a seemingly successful one. According to the newspaper clipping she read, his career had taken off, and so had that of his new wife, Dorothy Tierney. This marriage did not seem to be marred by the alcohol, beatings, and lies that had plagued her marriage to the same man. Meanwhile, Peg was now penniless and with no prospects for love or employment. A woman was hiking below the Hollywoodland sign on September 18, 1932, and found a woman's shoe, purse, and jacket. Inside the purse, she found Peg's suicide note. She then looked down the mountain and saw Peg's body. Peg remained a Jane Doe until she was identified by her uncle, who read her suicide note in the paper. The note had been signed P.E. She had been living with him and had told him a few days earlier that she was going for a walk to meet some friends. He hadn't seen her since. It appeared as though she had used a workman's ladder to climb to the top of the H on the Hollywoodland sign, which is about 50 feet tall, and jumped. Her suicide note, as published, read, quote, I am afraid, I am a coward, I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain, end quote. Although she was between opportunities, she wasn't really a failed actress at this point. Sure, she was disappointed that RKO hadn't worked out, but she had plays close early before with the Theater Guild and had other disappointments while being an actress. This time seemed different, though. James Zarouk, in his book entitled Peg Entwistle and the Hollywood Sign, a biography, opines that Peg did not kill herself because RKO fired her. She killed herself because RKO had hired her. He goes on to break down her suicide note. I am afraid, I'm a coward. He says that she considered herself a coward because she wasn't able to humble herself to go back to RKO or Broadway to ask for another chance. It never occurred to her to look for a different occupation either, if acting didn't work out. For her, it was acting or nothing. She probably felt as though she was a coward for not being able to ask for help. She had broken her commitment to complete her play by pursuing the opportunity with RKO, and when that didn't work out, she wasn't able to swallow her pride to try to go back. Breaking her agreement to complete the play was an almost unforgivable sin among Broadway circles. People had vouched for her to get her that role in the first place, and because she had not fulfilled her commitment to finish the run of the show, she was basically blacklisted, and she knew it. She also knew that if she had somehow made her way back to Broadway, that she'd be relegated to small and maybe even uncredited roles. This would be a step down that her ego would not let her take. I'm sorry for everything. While working on Broadway in New York, Peg was living with her good friend Mari. While the show was on tour in LA and Peg decided to stay in California to work for RKO, she assured Mari that she would still cover her part of the rent back in New York. Peg even said she would cover Mari's part of the rent too, since Mari had been out of work recently. However, when things didn't work out at RKO, Peg didn't have enough money to send to Mari, and Mari ended up being evicted and had to move to a Brooklyn tenement. This was something that Peg deeply regretted, as Mari was like a sister to her. Peg herself had to move back to a room at her uncle's house, ironically in the shadow of the Hollywoodland sign. If I had done this long ago, I could have saved a lot of pain. She was sorry for the disappointment that she caused and the trust that she had lost. She had let her ambition become more important than the people and the commitments in her life. Part of the irony surrounding her story is that a letter arrived the day after her suicide from RKO Studios offering her a lead role in a picture. It's a possibility that she wouldn't have taken that fateful jump if the studio had perhaps made a phone call instead of sending a letter. We'll never know. Some people believe that Peg's ghost still wanders around the Hollywood Hills. The first story emerged in the 1940s when the letter that Peg jumped from, mysteriously collapsed. Many people believe that it was her who caused the collapse. More ghost stories continued from there. In the 1990s, a couple saw, quote, a disoriented blonde woman who quickly vanished, end quote, who was wearing clothes from the 1930s. The couple who reported this sighting had never heard of Peg or her suicide. The people reporting sightings also report the smell of gardenias, her favorite perfume. For many people, especially those coming to LA to pursue their Hollywood dreams, Peg is a cautionary tale, a tale of what can happen if things don't work out for you in Hollywood. Like many others, Peg had seen the sign as a beacon of hope, but it turned out to be a haunting reminder of what never was.